It's such an honor to be here. I've been invited for the last couple of years, and this is the first year I could make it. And I think the only reason I'm invited is because I'm one of the few local national broadcast journalists that is local, and it saves the McCain Institute airfare. But it's such an honor, really, to be here. It feels like only yesterday that I had the opportunity to interview John McCain. I was 23 years old in Florence, South Carolina, and he was flanked by the most striking woman I'd ever seen, Cindy McCain, so poised. And I interviewed John McCain like this. I was holding a camera and a microphone. I was a one-man band in Market 114. Besides my proximity to Sedona, I'm based in Scottsdale, I thought of other ways in which I might connect my personal and professional life to this panel. One is that I covered the war in Iraq in 2003 and witnessed the immediate chaos and hope of Iraqis who saw the end of a dictatorship. Second is that I am a former Asia correspondent based in Beijing, China, and even as an expat, lived under an authoritarian regime and witnessed firsthand the human rights violations, the lack of rule of law, how that affected the populace. And lastly, I am the proud daughter of naturalized American citizens who immigrated to this country from Taiwan in 1969, saying they would never look back at what was then a military dictatorship. And decades later, Taiwan became a thriving democracy and a shining example of what is possible. So I just want to let each of you, everybody has your bio here, but let's just go through quickly, starting with you, Rachel. Tell us what your role is briefly at your organization.
Sure. So as the policy director of the Ronald Reagan Institute, which is the Washington, D.C. office of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute based at the Reagan Library in California, we're charged with actively advancing President Reagan's legacy in today's policy debates. And thankfully for me, as a John McCain alum, my immediate previous job was as John McCain's speechwriter and policy advisor on Capitol Hill. There's so much overlap between President Reagan's legacy, between John McCain's legacy, and I'm really proud to be a part of both of those legacies.
Dan?
I'm Dan Twining. I'm president of the International Republican Institute. I was hired by John McCain. He was chairman for 25 years, though I actually started working for him when I was 19, if you can believe that. We support democracy and freedom around the world. We are a core institute of the National Endowment for Democracy, which Congress continues to fund, understanding its role in the great power competition. NDI is also part of this, and I hope we can talk about America's 250th a bit and kind of the values that we were founded on and why we need to fight for them in the world, because that's what I think we do up here every day.
Absolutely. So I'm Tamara Wittes, president of the National Democratic Institute. Dan's organization and mine represent the bipartisan commitment of the American people as manifested in Congress every year. To support those around the world who share our democratic values and who are fighting for freedom, for security and stability and prosperity in their own countries. That was bipartisan from the start. President Reagan worked in partnership with Dante Fascell, the legendary chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, to pass the National Endowment for Democracy Act. And that act envisioned that the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, business, and labor would all, on behalf of American society, engage in this work. And today there are 4 institutes, of which we are 2, doing exactly that.
I want to just launch this by going back, to the 80s when Reagan conceived the 2 institutes you're both part of, and this idea that, of course, Vladimir just talked about, which is like, let's spread democracy to the world. And what each of you believe is the current support for that endeavor, either from the federal government or from the American people. And Rachel, I know your organization has done some polling around how Americans think about this mission.
We have. So when President Reagan delivered his 1982 Westminster address that Vladimir quoted from, that really launched that effort that ended in the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy and these organizations that Dan and Tamara represent that carry on that legacy. He knew that there were lots of reasons to start a campaign for democracy around the world, to cultivate and foster the infrastructure of democracy in countries around the world. There were strategic interests for that in terms of America's efforts in the Cold War to not just play containment or push toward easing relations or détente with the Soviet Union, but actually to go on the offense and promote democracy and freedom around the world. And he knew that there was a values piece, and Vladimir spoke to that too, that freedom was the inherent birthright of not just the American people, but of every individual around the world. And one thing we've done at the Reagan Institute is actually poll test in today's America those very same questions. Does America have a strategic interest in advancing democracy around the world? Does it have a strategic interest in even being engaged on the global stage? We hear so much in Washington, especially, about the isolationism kind of increasing among the American people and that Americans want to turn inward. What we found from our polling is that that's simply not true. It's not true among the American people, and it's not true among Republicans.
Do you define in that poll whether that includes kinetic military action or what that looks like? Do people understand?
Yeah, we ask about support for a strong military and a global U.S. military presence, and those numbers are high. But here's one to the topic of this panel that I want to emphasize on this question. Does America have a moral obligation to stand up for human rights and democracy around the world? Over 80% of Americans say yes, and over 80% of MAGA Republicans say yes. The MAGA Republican number is actually several points higher than the overall number among the American people. And so Americans seem to understand, both in terms of our interests and our values, that this work matters and the US government should be engaged in it.
I just want to note that even as storied a realist as Henry Kissinger wrote that America's foreign policy cannot long be sustained unless it represents the values of the American people. And I think that's, his understanding of that is reflected in that poll finding. I think it's also important to understand that Reagan in his Westminster speech, and all of us as we do this work, we are rooted in the idea that this desire for freedom exists in every society. It exists in every population. The opportunities don't always come around all that often because the adversaries of democracy, because selfish, corrupt, strongmen like to stay in power. But there are always people resisting dictatorship. That was true in the Taiwan that your parents left. And that is why Taiwan became a democracy. It wasn't any deus ex machina that made that happen. It was Taiwanese people who made that happen. And the same is true today. So, when I think about our moral obligation to support those seeking freedom around the world, I think about citizens who are seeking freedom, often from their own government, but sometimes from horrific wars, civil conflicts, intense poverty, and other crises. And building democratic politics, giving people the opportunity to have a government that is responsive to their needs, that creates stability. It creates economic development. It lengthens lifespans. It improves educational outcomes. It is a ticket to all the things that make the world a safer place for us, as well as for those citizens around the globe.
Daniel, do you see any pressure on organizations like yours right now or in the last few years? I know that in 2025, there were some funding losses for the types of organizations that support global democracies. I mean, has that changed? I mean, there's some members of Congress in here, so you have an opportunity to sort of, make that sell. And, do you feel that, we just heard from the panel on Venezuela, that the resources are available to support these grassroots efforts within countries that want democracy?
Thanks, Stephanie. So Congress has been very supportive of funding for democracy assistance, not just the National Endowment for Democracy, but other forms of it. I go back to something Jim Mattis said at IRI when he was Secretary of Defense. He said, where IRI succeeds, my Marines don't need to fight. And so I think part of the story that we need to tell is that America has a whole toolkit. And most of the time, we don't want to be using the kinetic toolkit. Most of the time, we want to be supporting people who want to pursue responsible self-government and effective democratic institutions. That's the work that we do around the world. It's unrealistic when realists say, well, you know, America needs to be very tough and not worry about democracy and human rights. America would be much better off if Democrats were running Venezuela. America would be much better off. We wouldn't be fighting a war if Democrats were running Iran. A third point is that I think we sometimes psych ourselves out. And with this idea, democracy is messy, right? Social media is dystopian. America's polarized. You know, do the bad guys have the advantage? Here's the real news. Authoritarians are having to work harder than ever to continue to repress and control their societies. Xi Jinping literally turned China into a totalitarian state after he took office, or after he seized power, perhaps. They have a total internet firewall. Russia is now censoring the internet in its own capital city and in its commercial capital. That has never happened before. Iran had to kill, those ayatollahs had to kill 45,000 of their own citizens in 24 hours to maintain their rule. So yes, we look at our world, democracy is messy, it's imperfect. In America, we've been working on it for 250 years. We're still working. But I think sometimes we allow the authoritarians to have the advantage. They know that what their people want is what we can do right here, right now, which is speak freely, express our opinions, organize, mobilize, assemble, right? Chinese people want it just like Taiwanese people wanted it under military dictatorship, just like South Koreans wanted it under military dictatorship before those countries became amazing American allies. Last point, Reagan, 1983, Ned. You could really count the number of democracies in the world on like your hands and feet in 1983. The world has really changed, right? America is much better off. We have better trade and investment partners. Our security is greater. We don't suffer mass migration when countries govern themselves effectively. So I think there's a moral case to make, and then there's just a very pragmatic national security kind of business case to make for why we care about these issues.
Can I reality check just a little bit? And I love my friend Dan, and I don't disagree with anything he just said. But I'm looking over here where I see a bunch of young folks. And I know that the polling tells us that young people, not only in the United States, but around the world, have a much more cynical view of democratic politics than my generation. And a lot of younger people ask, is this really working? Is it working for us? Especially when we look at a global economy that means that the rising generation may not even enjoy the same standard of living that we enjoy. And all of that, those are real concerns. I don't want to dismiss that. I think it's important to recognize that what makes democracy that path to stability and security is that it contains within itself the seeds to self-correct. If you don't like what you got, you can change it. And that's not something that people in the People's Republic of China are able to do right now. It's not something that Iranians are able to do, although they have, at the cost of their own lives, worked very hard to change that. It's also important for us to recognize that a lot of the cynicism and despair that we hear about democratic politics these days isn't coming from a vacuum. It is coming in part because these autocratic adversaries who are desperate to cling to their own power and are competing with the United States for influence in our shifting geopolitical environment, they're working very hard to convince our publics and publics in democracies all over the world not to trust their own government, not to have confidence.
And there's examples of that in recent elections.
Absolutely. I mean,
Europe and, yeah.
Dan's organization and mine were working in Moldova intently over the last 2 years, where Putin and his allies were pumping a fire hose of propaganda, of massively cryptocurrency-funded vote-buying campaign.
And suitcases of cash.
And suitcases of cash, all to tell Moldovans, all politicians are corrupt, Europe doesn't really want you, you might as well sell your vote. And we spent 2 years working with the Moldovan government and Moldovan civil society to push back against that fire hose of autocratic propaganda. We see it in Latin America, we see it in Africa, we see it in the Philippines. In fact, everywhere we work, we see Chinese and Russian and Iranian and North Korean information campaigns undermining our confidence in our own system.
What are the efficient and effective responses to that from organizations like yours?
Part of it is helping people understand what's really happening. Iranians understand what's happening in their country, and they hate their government, right? There were huge protests in China during and after COVID when people understood that they had a government that was not representative of them. In Venezuela, I agree with Leopoldo Lopez. We haven't yet had the transition. Over 2/3 of Venezuelans voted in a not real election in 2024 for democratic leadership, for Maria Corina Machado and her forces. So the answer is, anytime we can contribute to leveling the playing field, we chip away at this, frankly, this information blockade that authoritarians impose on their own people and project out to the rest of the world. There is huge demand for the work that we do in the world, much more than we can supply. This is not because countries want to import some American model. It's because they understand that their prosperity and their security rely on rule of law and property rights and governments that represent citizens. It's super interesting when we think about Russia. Putin wants to reconstitute the Russian Empire, right? Every country that was part of the Soviet Union has raced west to join Europe and NATO and the West. Now Ukrainians are holding the line. There is nobody who votes or willingly concedes that they want to be part of some kind of autocratic new empire. Not in Russia, not in Asia with China, not anywhere else. We actually need to be pretty confident in our values. And I think we've lost some of that confidence.
But there is this authoritarian bargain, right? There's this idea that I will feed you, I will take you out of poverty. That's what Xi's playbook is, right? I will lift millions of people out of poverty. I will make you safe in the contours of this one-party system. So specifically, how do you sell the democratic ideas? And I guess, Dan, you would say that it's working. Like there's still this like just universal desire. But you know, do the young people and does Gen Z, are they going to, is that where that movement is going to be? Or are we seeing something different there?
Well, one of the things we are seeing right now is that Gen Z, young people under 30, are really leading a lot of the revolutions that we're seeing around the world. In Africa, from Kenya to Morocco to Madagascar, in Eastern Europe, in Serbia and Georgia, in Nepal and Bangladesh and Indonesia. And to Tamara's point earlier, in a sense, they're revolutions for freedom and democracy, but what a lot of these young people are talking about is basic good governance, right? So their regimes are not lifting people out of poverty, they're spiking unemployment. Their regimes are not delivering basic government services, they're hotbeds of corruption, and young people are not standing for it. And so the ways that we're seeing sort of the global revolutions being driven by Gen Z, I think, is something for all of us to pay attention to, and really opens the door for the kinds of arguments that we can make about how democracy, while not perfect, as Winston Churchill famously said, can offer the opportunity to have a hand, to have a stake, to have a role in holding your leaders accountable for delivering good governance.
One thing that Dan already brought up is sort of technology and how surveillance technology that is certainly in the news today domestically, but also overseas, we're seeing like the effectiveness for totalitarian governments can to great effect use their surveillance and new technologies. On the other hand, I think social media has helped mobilize a lot of these movements, from the Arab Spring, which Tamara, I know you have a lot of expertise on upward to the Iranian rebellion that we saw recently. So where do you know, when I think of it as a journalist, I think that part of the issue is just the fracturing of information. And, you know, the fact that there isn't one truth that people have. And so there's these competing narratives. How much is that leading to challenges for developing democracies. Just the information landscape, which I guess is sort of a separate question from the technology question, but if you guys can tackle that.
Yeah, look, I mean, information technology is a tool, and it can be a tool of empowerment for communities and civic activists. It can be a way that government can make itself more transparent and more responsive and more accountable. You know, think about the sort of Fix My Pothole app that I think they tested in San Francisco. You know, you snap a picture of a pothole or an overgrown empty lot and you send it to the city. Right, so technology can be an incredible tool for accountable, responsive governance, but it can also be a tool of repression. I think that, you know, we went through this incredibly fast transformation of our information environment from, you know, everybody watching 3 television channels to Americans, by and large, getting their news from social media where the algorithms drive them into silos. So we have to acknowledge that the way our information technology is working today is exacerbating some problems in our democracy. It's not facilitating that core democratic skill of dialogue across difference, right? We gotta do that. And that's one of the reasons why this forum is so important, that it brings people together from different parties, from different backgrounds, different views. So we need to do that for ourselves. And I actually, you know, I have 2 young adult children who do not spend all their day scrolling on their phones because they're sick of it. And I think that's a healthy development. I hope it spreads. But, you know, on the surveillance point, what I would say is once you have a government that is not accountable to its people, it is going to abuse its power. And it will use surveillance technology in order to identify threats to its power and shut them down. And the Chinese have probably extended that, developed it farther than any other authoritarian state, but they are not the only ones. What I think is very disturbing about the Chinese use of technology is that they're now using it not only to repress at home, but also to identify refugees from the PRC or diaspora activists or 2nd and 3rd generation activists for human rights in China and target them in the countries where they live through social media, but also through doxing them and creating real physical threats to their lives.
Do we need to start having more technologists in the room, in this room, you know, when we're talking about democracy?
We need to understand that technology is the primary battleground. Xi Jinping said in 2012 in an internal Chinese Communist Party plenum, the record leaked years later, he said the internet is the primary battleground, right? We have to take this very seriously. If China controls the commanding heights of AI and the technology revolution we're all living through that's transforming our societies and our lives all over the world, freedom will be extinguished. We won't be able to have these conversations. China is already exporting its surveillance censorship suite to nearly 100 countries. China is conducting very intensive and sophisticated forms of transnational digital repression all over the world. I don't think Americans understand in the technology domain what many American leaders have understood throughout certainly the last 100 years, which is that our freedom at home is not safe in a world where authoritarianism is on the march. And I think we understand that in terms of not letting Russia conquer Europe or not letting China conquer Asia. We haven't yet come to grips with the fact that this campaign is fundamentally in the technology space. And our freedoms could be extinguished without us ever firing a shot if we lose this tech race.
I do want to spend this last minute before I bring it to the audience for Q&A to talk about the 250th anniversary. And I know that a few of you on the panel have written pieces about it recently as we reflect on sort of the beginning of this experiment and what the founding fathers envisioned. I think some of us were taught that we were an island and we were isolated and we were protected in a way that the Europeans were not. And both of you, Rachel and Dan, have argued in recent pieces that this was always part of what the founders envisioned, that we would spread democracy. Can you both talk about that?
Yeah, so one of the myths of the American founding, in particular, somebody at a presidential foundation, I think about presidential legacies a lot, and one of the great myths is that George Washington understood foreign policy in the way that you just described, Stephanie, that we were an island, that we should be isolationists, that we should not embroil ourselves or entangle ourselves in the politics of foreign affairs. And while he did craft a nuanced statesmanship on early American foreign policy, famously he promoted neutrality, but not for the sake of isolationism, not to withdraw America from global affairs, but actually to engage in diplomacy, both with the French and with the British in those days. I recently came across a great Washington quote where he said that, you know, if we were careful in our early steps, the day would come that we could base American foreign policy, we could shape American foreign policy as our interests guided by justice shall counsel. And so President Washington, even in those earliest days of our republic, knew that it wasn't just our interests, it was also the ways that our interests are inextricably linked to our values, to universal values, to justice and freedom and liberty. And that's something that I think we would do well to remember 250 years into the American experiment.
The founders believed that all people were given natural and unalienable rights, that their rights are not the gift of their government. Their rights are inherent to them as human beings. Now, they didn't have the whole picture 250 years ago. I mean, my old boss, Condoleezza Rice, argues that basically the last 250 years have been America's attempt to live up to that ideal, that all people have these universal, unalienable, God-given rights, natural rights. By the way, people believe that all over the world. People don't just think that. People believe that in Taiwan. People believe that in Venezuela. People believe that in Russia.
People probably believe that in North Korea.
People believe it all over the world,
Where
across
they've
Africa.
had no exposure
Yes.
to the outside world.
Yes. So our founders understood that America was not only a democratic Republican experiment, it was the only democratic republic in the world when it was founded 250 years ago. But they then spent subsequent generations trying to project the fact that the world, for America's Republican experiment to be safe, we needed an enabling environment for that in the form of a freer, more open world. And you can draw a line through 250 years of American history based on that founding principle.
I'm going to open it up for questions, but just also end with this quote that early in my career, I heard from a Nobel Prize-winning economist who said, and this will relate to the next panel on food, that, quote, no famine has ever taken place in the history of the world in a functioning democracy with a relatively free press. And I do hope there are other opportunities to talk about freedom of the press, as my profession is under pressure from many sides. Mm-hmm. Okay, do we have any questions? And I'm not sure if we have a microphone or I see a, yes. Okay, the gentleman in the back in the blue jacket. Oh, right here. There's a...
Thank you. I think one of the hallmarks of democracy is self-criticism.
Yes.
And so my question is, what is the strategy behind eliminating Radio Free Europe and many other of the programs that try to broadcast American democracy around the world? What is the answer to, you mentioned that there are far more democracies today than there were 25 years ago. But in the last 5 years or so, America has slipped dramatically in the Freedom House schedule of democracies. How do you account for that? There's something called the Social Progress Index.
Yeah.
And America is ranked relatively low in the Social Progress Index. When people ask you around the world about America and American democracy, how do you respond to those questions? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And I respond to it by referencing what Dan was citing Condoleezza Rice about, that our democracy is an ongoing experiment. It is an aspiration that we're constantly working to both renew and improve. And the same is true for every other democratic society around the world. And more than ever in my lifetime, I think, we're living through a moment where democratic societies need each other. Dan spoke about why democratic governments need each other, and I think he's right. But I think we societies need each other. We need each other to give one another a reality check about the health of our own systems. We need one another to share good ideas about how to improve those systems. Where in the world did the first great lessons for the media come from on responding to authoritarian influence campaigns and the kind of slop that the internet can produce? It came from the Philippines. And Maria Ressa of the Philippines, Nobel Prize winner, is now training journalists all over the world from here in the United States. And maybe American journalists have something to learn from that experience, right? So I think we can help each other renew our democracies. Our longtime chairman at NDI, Madeleine Albright, who was a great partner with Senator McCain in this work, she used to always say, I believe in democracy because it's the only system that believes in us. It's us, we're the ones who fix it. Our institutions aren't perfect, and our institutions are full of people. So we can fix that. And I think we need to have the confidence in our own role, and we have to gain the skills and get the lessons we need to do it well.
The gentleman's specific question, Dan, I wonder if you'll answer, which is broadcasting, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, and I think he's referring to sort of the defunding of those organizations. How important are those as part of like the toolkit that you talked about earlier?
I mean, I found it incomprehensible. The ending of Tibetan language broadcasting, Uyghur language broadcasting by Doge. The only person that benefited was Xi Jinping. It's incomprehensible. I have very interesting conversations with Republicans in Congress and in the Trump administration about what should the toolkit of American influence be in the year 2026. Now, USAID was built in the Kennedy administration at the beginning of the 1960s. It was not the right instrument, actually. But what are the right instruments? And the answer is a sophisticated form of broadcasting that reaches people digitally and on their phones, right?
In their own languages.
Yes, democracy assistance, the foundational work that we are doing, bottom up, not top down, to help build more successful, prosperous, free societies that can look after themselves and not undermine international security or international peace. Smart investments by the United States to counter things like China's digital Belt and Road, its real Belt and Road, the corruption and coercion associated with China's form of, quote, soft power. Let's counter that with our own, which is democratic and open and empowering to people instead of kind of neo-colonial and eviscerating of their independence. I think it's a very interesting conversation to have. The last thing I would like to say, I thought the question was excellent, and I wish we had more time to talk about it. Thomas Jefferson had a great line. He said, look, where governments are afraid of their citizens, there's liberty. Where citizens are afraid of their governments, there's tyranny. And so I think we have to think about a free society requires a balance between government executive power and the power of society. That's all of us, right? And when that comes out of balance, bad things happen.
Are there any other questions? Would love to get to some of the students. Yeah, the gentleman in the suit in the front. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say thank you guys so much for providing all of this wealth of information and knowledge that you can. My question is looking at how important U.S. soft power is and how our influence throughout the globe is seen not just on that kinetic level like you talked about, but with programs like USAID and Radio Free Europe. How would you talk to someone in one of these countries that's affected by a loss of these campaigns, a loss of funding, that they're actively impacted, and how would you say that they should be able to regain trust in us as an ally and overall as a democracy promoting other democracies abroad?
I love the question because the focus is on the people in these countries working for their own freedom. And that is the heart of all of this work. It has never been about, and this goes back to Vladimir's opening as well, it's never been about imposing American will or American values, but it's been about supporting those that are are fighting on the front lines of freedom in those countries. And so obviously we're in a time of great upheaval with regard to the structures in our country that do that work. But I think the message that I would humbly send is whatever the new structures look like, whether they're governmental, non-governmental with government funding, et cetera, whatever they look like, or private sector driven, the importance is on the thirst for freedom, the hunger for freedom and democracy that exists in those countries, and their work is always going to be the most important in securing progress toward democracy.
I see the clock is at 0, but do we have time for any more questions? I know that let's try to fit in a couple more. Okay, the gentleman in the plaid shirt in the front. Thank you.
All right. All right. First of all, I just want to say this was a tremendous discussion. I really enjoyed listening to it. But I guess my question, and it actually goes back to Dr. Wittes' point, kind of how Gen Z is feeling very dissatisfied. And a lot of it comes from foreign propaganda. But I also believe a lot of it comes from the fact that a lot of young Americans have just been deprived economically. And I think there is a real democratic backslide happening in the United States. I mean, there's redistricting efforts from both sides, from Republicans and Democrats in California, Illinois, Texas, and Florida. And there is just an overall sense that billionaires control everything. Whether or not that is true remains to be seen. But I guess my question is, how can we even begin to exert American values such as freedom, democracy, and liberty to the rest of the world if it seems like they're under attack here? We like to see we like to say we're the beacon of liberty around the world, but unfortunately, a sad truth, it's that the radical left, radical right elements are on the rise in our generation. So it's up to your generation to ensure that whenever it comes to our generation, that we have a democracy. So how do we ensure that? Thank you.
Yeah, Tamara.
Thank you. It's the right challenge. And here's my very quick answer. We don't have to be, and in fact, we are not effective supporting democratic actors around the world when we say, hey, America is the model, follow us. We are effective when America can be a model of working the issue. And what I would say to young folks, what I say to my own young adult children, is that if you don't like it, join something. Talk to your neighbors. Get together. Pick an issue. You don't have to do it all. Pick one and get to work, because this is, with all its flaws, a system that is wide open for you to influence. It's not easy. It's not fast. Everyone in this room can tell you about policy battles, political battles they've fought and lost and lost and lost before they won. But they won. And you can do that too. Renew our democracy.
Dan, I'm
So
going to
I
let you
live in
have the last
Virginia,
one.
which went from a 50-50 state with the most balanced delegation in Congress to possibly a one-party state because of this referendum. So I'm with you on gerrymandering in Virginia. But I must say, I couldn't get my 18-year-old son or any of his rather extensive group of friends to vote. So the challenge would be back at you, right? We're standing on the shoulders of 250 years of Americans who fought in all sorts of ways. The civil rights struggle, the Revolutionary War. It's for every generation, as Ronald Reagan said. You have to vote, you have to participate, you have to join political parties. Even if you're a political independent, guess who votes in primaries that select candidates? People who are registered in parties. This is the advice we give to people all over the world, right?
Yes.
Don't just be an angry youth. Mobilize, organize, vote. Make those parties listen to you.
Don't boycott elections. Vote in elections.
Thank you so much for those questions, and thank you so much for this distinguished conversation.